development plan continues to boil over. It's alarming many of our residents of Penn South and transit advocates, as well as CRDC members. And, we're fortunate enough tonight to have an exciting discussion this evening led by Layla Law-Gisiko, who's a club member and also the chair of the Land Use Committee on Community Board 4. During the past assembly race held in the 75th, Layla ran for the assembly spot, and she continues to be an active advocate and an outstanding opponent of the Empire State Development Plan. We're very pleased to have her tonight lead the discussion this evening with our guest speaker, Mr. Emery, and having read the papers as a listener, really interested in hearing tonight's discussion. So I welcome Mr. Emery, and Layla, you can take it away now.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. Thank you. And I am really delighted to be joined by Richard Emery. Richard has been a litigator and a lawyer in New York City for most of his career. For those of you who don't know him, Richard is a graduate of Columbia University. He started his career with the Civil Liberties Union. And he is most well known for a case that he brought against the Board of Estimates that he actually litigated in front of the U.S. Supreme Court and won a unanimous judgment that basically undid the Board of Estimates that was deemed not constitutional. Richard is among the top environmental lawyers in the city and one of the top litigators. We're very, very pleased that he is joining us tonight. Richard has been involved more recently, actually, with the Penn Station plan on a number of litigations, and we're just really, really thrilled to be able to discuss those issues with him. So, Richard, welcome, and thank you so much for making us the honor of being with us tonight.
Well, I'm happy to be here. We're in the thick of this issue, and I must say that Layla has been critical to our efforts of putting together the groups that will oppose Penn Station in litigation, probably starting next week. And she has been both intellectually important in thinking about the issues and how to frame them, as well as very helpful in putting together the appropriate coalition. And Brad Hoylman is on this call. And he, of course, has been outspoken throughout the Penn Station issues. And I'm a huge admirer of Brad's. Brad is a very important legislator for these issues and many, many others. So I'm honored to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So let's jump right in. My first question, Richard, is, this project has garnered a lot of opposition. It took basically two governors and over 2 years to get the project to a vote by ESD, the Empire State Development Corporation, which is the state economic development agency. Is the next battle going to be fought in court? Is that what we are heading towards?
Oh, yes. I think it's pretty clear that, well, we have no choice at this point. We submitted, Chuck Weinstock has been critical, and he couldn't be here tonight, but he's been a critical resource, and he will be on the papers with my firm and has done a lot of real estate litigation. And he prepared a long and very involved objections to the proposed, the DEIS, it's called, the first stage of the environmental impact statement, where we put together a lot of technical information and a lot of legal information to show that what ESD was proposing is both legally deficient and factually deficient. And that is very much the genesis of the lawsuit. But what that meant is that when ESD last June adopted the final environmental impact statement, and then subsequently the GPP, the plan for the Vornado developments around Penn Station as a purported mechanism of financing Penn Station, which we can discuss at some length, is ridiculous. It was triggered. It triggered 120 days within which we had to file the case to challenge those two actions, as well as the actions of the PACB, the Public Authorities Control Board, that took place in July. So we have a deadline coming up at the end of next week, after which we could still do certain forms of litigation, but to preserve all of our claims, really do have to file next week.
Excellent. So actually, apart from this litigation that you guys are going to file next week, there are actually litigations, or one at least for sure, that has been filed by Chuck in regards to a FOIL request, Freedom of Information Law. So it looks like there were documents that you guys were able to secure, and the documents that ESD agreed to provide actually tells a pretty damning story about the relationship between Vornado and ESD. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Sure. One of the precursors to this whole effort was this FOIL request. And they fought us tooth and nail for a year on various objections. We responded, went back and forth, and they finally were convinced to produce some small percentage of the communications between Vornado and ESD and the governor's office that were quite revealing, even as thin a group of these communications as they did produce. We expect to get much more, and we're in court now seeking many more of those communications. But what they did reveal is a kind of a joint effort. It already feels that this is not really ESD passing as a regulatory agency or as a oversight mechanism for a development. It is rather a kind of a partnership, that even financial partnership, where Vornado was paying a lot of the expert expenses that
I'll be back.
ESD incurred. And so it is sort of an unholy alliance as we see it, inappropriate roles, especially where we believe that Vornado was really dominating the process and guiding the process, and ESD appears, and we'll soon, this will come out, I think, that ESD was doing Vornado's bidding rather than the other way around.
So actually, in the lawsuit that you filed in regards to this FOIL request, and for people, FOIL stands for Freedom of Information Law or Freedom of Information Act, and it is a law that basically allows anyone, any citizen, and any individual seek documents because from a public agency because they are deemed public, and it seems that ESD is still, although they have released a number of these documents, Richard, they're still refusing to provide some of those under the excuse that they are trade secrets. How can ESD and Vornado have trade secrets? Are we missing something?
I don't think we're missing anything. I think it's a very thinly veiled attempt to block embarrassing communications, but we shall see. I mean, trade secrets are an exception to the FOIL, but in this case, I think it's quite different. And I think I think a judge reviewing this in chambers is very likely to say that these are not trade secrets, and that there's nothing particularly proprietary or financially sensitive that would in some way deprive Vornado of its opportunities, its profit-making opportunities. So I think the definition of a trade secret will not be satisfied here, but I can't tell you that for certain because that's a judge's decision.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting.
Yeah.
So the rationale for the state to actually take over these 6 city blocks and to propose demolishing them is that the area is blighted. But actually, when you read the environmental impact statement and the neighborhood condition study, they actually fail to make this case. Is that going to be one of the objections that you're going to make in the lawsuit?
Yes, we are asserting on a couple of different grounds that the Urban Development Corporation Act, the UDC Act, is not fulfilled. You see, the reason, let me take a step back, Layla, and that is the reason this is important is because this area is zoned by the city. And it's been zoned and upzoned several times in the last decades to accommodate development. And in fact, it's a very fertile area for development under the city. We need to get somebody to mute. Yeah.
Can everybody go on mute when you're not speaking? It is actually pretty distracting.
The upzonings make this a fertile area for development, even under the current zoning. However, Vornado was voracious, to use a phrase that might fit the name, in its desire to have substantially more floor area ratio in its development than the city zoning would allow. And it seems to be that was the impetus for Governor Cuomo initially and now Governor Hochul to indulge Vornado in what the ESD powers are deemed an override, a state override of the zoning resolutions applicable to this area. But one of the grounds for overriding is so-called blight. And blight is just factually ridiculous in this situation. Even by their own environmental impact statement, only 6 or 7% of the sites are blighted within the GPP area, the area where the override is asserted. And one of them, interestingly, is an Amtrak building, which of course is probably being held for this purpose to up the blight percentage and also just perhaps being reserved for future purposes of developing the station. So it's really it's kind of shocking and a bit, I think, helpful to us that they're asserting blight because it is so poorly shown that there is any such thing as blight.
It is actually pretty scary because, if this plan were to prevail or, if no one were to challenge it, then it sets a terrible precedent. Doesn't it mean that then, the governor can come in any neighborhood and decide that, he or she is going to invade and take over? What keeps her from actually going elsewhere in our district?
It certainly, we would say, is arbitrary, because if this is considered blighted, it would be arbitrary and it would open the door for virtually any area of the city, especially if you have the power to draw the area, to draw the district, to qualify under blight. So I think it actually is remarkable, and I'd be very surprised if any judge relies on that particular claim as the basis for allowing ESD to go forward for us to lose.
I was on mute, sorry. There's another issue that we've been talking quite a bit, and people get totally confused actually because they don't understand what 10 towers have to do with fixing Penn Station. And actually, deliberately, and this is something that we've argued all along, and ESD has told us that no, it's not segmented, but it is segmented, meaning that there is a real estate plan that is going to build 10 towers that is entirely disconnected from the plan to fix Penn Station, which is, below ground and does not have any direct connection with those towers. And this is actually legally, this is a big deal, right? Segmentation.
Yeah, segmentation is one of our primary claims. And it is defined by the fact that the purpose of this plan is to supposedly finance or help finance Penn Station's renewal. We're getting a lot of interference here, I think. Okay, but the plan itself, even though the plan is specifically, the purpose is a stated purpose is to help finance Penn Station through pilots, they're called. These are the payments in lieu of taxes. The reality is that no finances are involved. That's a whole part of this thing. But that if the purpose is to finance Penn Station, which is outside the area of this particular plan or the Vornado plan, then one has to know something about Penn Station and one has to understand what's going on with Penn Station in order for the purposes of this plan to be in any way pursued or fulfilled. And of course, that's not part of this. They have specifically declined to do any analysis of what the costs will be for Penn Station, the timing, the costs, the sources, the other sources of revenue from New Jersey, from the federal government. There's some thumbnail sketches, but there's nothing of any substance or of any tangible meaning for purposes of this pursuing this GPP and this ESD override. And the consequence means that it is essentially a segmented project from the very purpose that takes place outside of the area that is being now considered under the GPP, this plan.
Yeah. And also the fact that ESD and Vornado share actually most of their consultants, including their land use lawyer, their financial consultant, their land use consultant, their land use lawyer, their architectural firm. All these firms are actually on a cost-sharing agreement. How is that not a conflict of interest?
Well, look, it is a conflict of interest without question. The question is whether it's illegal or not. It certainly shows, it reveals the kind of the arrangement which I described earlier of it being a partnership rather than a government regulating or stimulating a particular development. There weren't RFPs. There won't be RFPs for these buildings, for the Vornado buildings. There may be requests for proposal for developers for some of the other sites, but Vornado is locked into these sites where they own. They wouldn't necessarily have to develop it, but they own it. In any event, it is definitely a conflict of interests, not perhaps an actionable one which prevents the development, but it's a conflict of interest which will certainly be interesting in the context of everything else that we say is illegal and arbitrary and capricious. Many agencies, I hate to say it, but it's the truth, many agencies of the federal government and some other agencies do have arrangements where the applicants and the people regulated pay for the costs of the analysis by the agency. But this is pretty crass. This is clearly a joint effort to, at least from what we can tell so far, from what we can tell from the communications we have so far, and the way the money's flowed, a joint effort to orchestrate a result rather than reach a rational and thoughtful result between two parties who are should be in some ways competing. I mean, ESD should be fighting for the greatest amount of money and fighting for the most efficient process to generate that money. But of course, they've agreed to an override that in principle provides these huge benefits immediately to Vornado without any revenue coming in the foreseeable future, without any timing for the building or requirement that Vornado build within a certain amount of time and therefore generate revenue. And of course, ESD and the state and we as taxpayers are on the hook for the bonds that will be issued by ESD, assuming PAC, the Public Authorities Control Board, approves them for these developments. And so it is an unseemly partnership and relationship, the evidence for which is this sharing of costs that you were referring to.
And, to take it one notch further, it's been, abundantly reported in the press that Vornado has been one of the most generous contributors to Governor Cuomo's campaign and now today to Governor Hochul's campaign. I mean, this whole Vornado ESD deal seems to be the poster child for pay to play. Why is it not illegal?
Well, I mean, we all know, Brad can probably speak to this better than I can, that in this state and certainly in this city, you don't. It's a cost of doing business. That's not to say you get the deal. It's not to say politicians are corrupt just because they take campaign contributions. We have a lousy system for electing officials that requires enormous expenditures of money, and they have to raise it. We don't have public financing except in the city itself. In the statewide, the financing of elections is done through contributors. The biggest contributors are always the corporate interests, or often the corporate interests, people who want access. I think the function of the political contributions, quite frankly, is the terrible appearance of it. It's awful. And the protections it gets constitutionally, which I think are disgraceful. Money is not speech, but the Supreme Court has said it is speech. But it's not, it's money. And so, but we have a system where it's protected by the First Amendment. And therefore, people have to, especially public officials who have to run for election and who have to raise a lot of money, inevitably are, and the Supreme Court has allowed this, selling access, not necessarily, they don't sell results. If they sell results based on campaign contributions, that's a crime. But if they sell access, make themselves accessible because people give them large contributions, that's not a crime. It's unseemly, but it's not a crime.
Well, actually, the sliver of good news is that the state will have some, public funding kicking in. I think the day after the general election, there will be some form of a matching fund program and a cap that will be actually lower, especially for candidates for governor, which I think is really a good thing. But my last question, and then I think we can open it up to the rest of the group. I'm sure lots of people have questions, but as someone who single-handedly took on the Board of Estimates, a good political fight. You also know a good legal fight. What do you make of the fact that the coalition, the community boards, the elected officials, all these people, all these groups, all these entities that are opposed to the plan were not able to win the political fight against this plan?
Well, it's a constant tension, and it certainly was stark in the Cuomo administration, where obviously Andrew Cuomo had as high priority building things, building whatever he could build, and put his father's name on it in some instances, or just build. And there's nothing wrong in principle with being a builder if you do it the right way. But it's very hard to get anything done in New York State or anywhere else if you have to jump through more hoops than allow you to finish the job at some point during your administration. And clearly, the problem is that balance, right? The balance, it has to be between getting community and public participation through interchange and through proper processes versus ramming things down people's throats. And but there has to be a process. And the problem here is that in this case, as in so many other cases where ESD is involved and where executive officials want to get something done, even at the cost of fighting with local officials. This case is an example of ramming it down our throats, and that is a shame. And I think I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic that we can defeat that process, at least at this stage of things.
But it will be in a court of law and not through a political process. My hope is that, at some point we'll be able to, engage in a meaningful fashion. I mean, wouldn't it be great that there is community buy-in for a project that, everybody can live with? That's my hope.